Good afternoon, and welcome to the second event in the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center's 21-22 Public Events Series, Regeneration. My name is Susan Derwin, and I am the IHC Director. As the public face of the humanities for the UC Santa Barbara campus, our center mounts programs, including this series, that draw upon the expertise, practices, and skills associated with the humanities to support scholars in the production of new knowledge and to empower community members as agents of social change. Before I introduce today's guest, I want to make sure you are aware of the question and answer function on your screen. You can submit questions to our speaker at any time during the event, and when our conversation concludes, we will pose as many of your questions as possible to him. Live closed captioning is available today as well. Finally, I would like to acknowledge the Chumash people, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center is located. And I would also like to pay respect to Chumash elders, both past and present, as well as to other Indigenous peoples present. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our guest, Clint Smith. Dr. Smith received his PhD in education in spring of 2020 from Harvard University, where he wrote a dissertation entitled, "What if they opened that door one day? What education means to people sentenced to juvenile life without parole." He started working as a staff writer at The Atlantic in September of last year. In 2014, he was the National Poetry Slam champion. His book of poetry, Counting Descent, won the 2017 Literary Award for Best Poetry Book from the Black Caucus of the American Library Association. In June of this year, he published How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America. The book was #1 in the nonfiction category on the New York Times bestsellers list. Dr. Smith was raised in New Orleans, and in the prologue to his new book, he recalls how, in May of 2017, the statue of Robert E. Lee was taken down from its 60-foot pedestal near downtown New Orleans, as were other Confederate statues in the city. And he writes that when this happened, he became obsessed with the issue of how slavery is remembered and reckoned with, and with teaching himself all the things he wishes someone had taught him long ago. This obsession led him to write his book, a reflection on 8 different sites of public memory, where at each place, and I quote, "people have tasked themselves with telling the story of that place outside the traditional classrooms and beyond the pages of textbooks. These people are, formally or informally, public historians who carry with them a piece of this country's collective memory." The places he visited include Thomas Jefferson's plantation Monticello, the Whitney Plantation in Wallace, Louisiana, a cemetery in which 30,000 Confederate soldiers are buried, and the Louisiana State Penitentiary, which is built on the land of a plantation. He also visited a site in Dakar, Senegal. Dr. Smith, thank you very much for agreeing to speak with us today about your work. We are so very happy that you're here. And so the first site you discuss in your book is the Monticello Plantation. And you visited the plantation a couple of times, and you went on several of the tours they offer. And you write how at Monticello, they're working to make their tours accurately reflect the history of slavery as it occurred on the plantation. So can you start by telling us a few of the things you learned about how this history is being presented?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. It is a pleasure to be here. I'm going to pretend that I'm in Santa Barbara, which is a much more aesthetically pleasing place than Silver Spring, Maryland. But hopefully we are moving toward a future where we can do these things in person again, because there is, as nice as it is to be in my slippers, there is no substitute for being in a room with folks and having these conversations. So the first chapter of the book is Monticello. And part of the reason I wanted to start with Monticello is because I think that Jefferson is in many ways a sort of microcosm or a sort of personification of the story of America, in the sense that America is a place that has provided unparalleled, unimaginable opportunities for millions of people across generations toward upward mobility and wealth accumulation in ways that their ancestors could have never imagined. But it has also done so at the direct expense of millions and millions of other people who have been intergenerationally subjugated and oppressed. And both of those things are the story of America. It is, and it's not that one sits here and one sits here, it's that they are deeply entangled in one another, is that they sort of rely, their respective existences rely on one another. And I think Jefferson similarly is somebody who embodies the sort of cognitive dissonance and the tensions of this country, in the sense that he is someone who wrote in one document that all men are created equal, and wrote in another document that Black people are inferior to white people in both endowments of body and mind, who said the slave is incapable of love, the slave is incapable of possessing and sustaining complex emotion, writing about Phillis Wheatley, who was considered to be the first published Black American poet in the history of the United States, that he said that her work was, quote, below the dignity of criticism, that it wasn't even worth engaging with because love, as he puts it, love is the ostrom of the poet. And Black people do not possess the emotional capacity or the mental acuity with which to experience love and to transcend to a sort of emotional state in which they would be able to encounter what love is. And he said that their senses are carnal, right, and not actually able to excuse me, that they are not actually able to engage with and experience love, and love is necessary to create art. And so Phillis Wheatley can't be a poet because she is a Black woman, and Black people cannot reach the emotional state necessary to create these things. He also is someone who wrote, one of the most important documents in the history of the Western world, and also enslaved over 600 people over the course of his lifetime, including 4 of his own children that he had by an enslaved woman, Sally Hemings. And so when I go to Monticello, part of what I'm trying to understand is, how does an institution that is committed to preserving the legacy of one of our founding fathers, and a very specific founding father, how do they tell the story of who that person was holistically and in context and in relation to one another? How can we understand that we can't understand who Jefferson was as a statesman, as a philosopher, as a scientist, without also understanding who he was as an enslaver? And not only how is that place telling the story of Jefferson, but how is that place making sure that the story of Monticello is not singularly tied to Thomas Jefferson, which is to say, Monticello belongs, if not as much, if not more, to the enslaved families who lived there. You know, just logistically, Jefferson was away from Monticello for extended periods of time over the course of decades in his various roles with the US government in Paris, in New York, in Philadelphia, in Washington, DC. And it was the Hearnses and the Fawcetts and the Grangers and the Hemingses who built the buildings on that land, who cultivated that land, who created memories on that land, who created families on that land, who that land belongs to, again, more so than it belongs to Jefferson in so many ways. And so is this place telling the story of the enslaved families as well as the Jefferson and Jefferson's acknowledged family. And what I find is that they are more committed to telling that story than they've ever been. One of the things that I hear from people all the time who read the book is that they might have gone to Monticello 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. And they email me and they're like, no, when I went, nobody said the word Sally Hemings. Like, you never heard Sally Hemings anywhere. Nobody talked about Jefferson as a slaveholder. And so it is a place, I think, that embodies what a public history site can and should do in response to new information. Because what's happened is they got new information from Annette Gordon Reed's book, Annette Gordon Reed being a seminal sort of Jefferson Hemings historian, and whose book, The Hemingses of Monticello, was a sort of watershed moment that helped give us more clarity about who the Hemings family was and who Sally Hemings was and who her children were, and how Jefferson, and sort of provided irrefutable evidence that Jefferson was their father. And so they have been, after being an institution for years that preserved a very specific story and a very narrow story and a very inaccurate story of who Jefferson was, they have done a sort of holistic reassessment in which they have committed themselves more forthrightly saying Jefferson was an enslaver. He is the father of these enslaved people who and he is the father of, he is the father of children who he would subsequently enslave for their entire childhood before he eventually freed them as a child. And the people I encounter there are perhaps the most interesting. I'm on a tour with a guy named David Thorson, and in 45 minutes, he gives this sort of masterclass of Jefferson and the sort of tension and cognitive dissonance of Jefferson. And I'm watching these two women, Donna and Grace, who are on the tour with me. And you can see their faces wilting and their mouths sort of hang agape. And after the tour, I go up to them and I say, you know, I'd love to hear about how you just experienced what you just heard. And I'll always remember Donna said, man, he really took the shine off the guy. She's like, I had no idea Jefferson owned slaves. I had no idea Monticello was a plantation. And mind you, these are people who bought plane tickets, who rented cars, who got hotel rooms, who came to this site as a sort of pilgrimage to see the home of one of our founding fathers, and had no idea that Jefferson was an enslaver, had no idea that this place was a plantation. And what that moment was incredibly important for me as a writer and for the trajectory of the book, because I realized that I had to have my own reflections of these sites in conversation with the experiences and reflection of other people who are also there, to reflect the plurality of experiences, because the truth is that millions, what Donna and Grace represent is that millions of people across this country don't understand the history of slavery in any way that is commensurate with the actual impact and legacy it continues to have on this country.
And it's not even that there isn't an awareness, but you talk about the one of the people who works there, Teresa, who said that working at Monticello has been a journey not only of learning, but of unlearning.
Right.
So, yeah. All right. Well, another of the places you visited was Blandford Cemetery in Petersburg, Virginia, where about 30,000 Confederate soldiers are buried. And you went there twice, first for a tour, and then again on Memorial Day, I think it was in 2019.
Right.
And in your chapter on the cemetery, you provide extensive historical information, for example, about Robert E. Lee's attitude towards slavery, about the origin of Memorial Day, the song Dixie, the Lost Cause movement, the myth of Black Confederate soldiers. And it seems to me that the information you provide is doing the work of sort of correcting and protecting the historical record as it's being advanced at Blandford Cemetery. So can you talk about how the Civil War was represented by the people you spoke with at the cemetery, and also what prompted you to return to the cemetery on Memorial Day?
One of the things that I've so appreciated about the process of writing this book is that it's you begin a nonfiction book and you have certain ideas, especially a nonfiction book based on that is in part a sort of travel log that is reflective of like a literal journey you are taking to different places across the country. And so I initially had no plans to write about Blandford. I had never heard of Blandford. I had no plans to write about Confederate cemeteries, but I was planning on writing a chapter on Civil War battlefields. And so I went to Petersburg, which was the site of the siege of Petersburg at the end of the Civil War, and thought I was going to write about Civil War battlefields and Black soldiers on these battlefields. But I went on a tour of one, and I was having a conversation with the guy there about my project. And he was like, oh, you got to go to Blandford. And I was like, Blandford, what is that? And he was like, it's this Confederate cemetery about 10 minutes away. And I kind of looked at my watch and I was like, well, how much of my marriage capital do I want to use in staying down here in Petersburg longer than I told my wife I would, because we were also, as I was writing this book, we started our family. And at this point, I think I had a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. And so anytime you leave your co-parent alone, you are going into co-parent debt in some way. So I knew that she was gonna get to have, a double brunch with her friends or something like that this weekend. So that next weekend, so I can make it up to her. But I decided to go to Blandford, and I went on this tour. And, it was fascinating because I was getting a tour of the Blandford Cemetery. For context, is one of the largest Confederate cemeteries in the country, where the remains of 30,000 Confederate soldiers are buried. And I was getting this tour of the church that's at the center of the cemetery. And in the span of an hour, we talked about the history of the church and the these beautiful stained glass windows. But at no point during the conversation did anybody say anything about why the windows were erected, even though on the windows, it literally says these windows were erected to celebrate the legacy and the bravery and the courage of our fallen sons and brothers and fathers of the Confederate Army of South Carolina. You know, each different windows for a different state. So South Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. And then I went and had a conversation with them in the visitor center. And as I was having a conversation with the curators at the visitor center, I saw a flyer on the counter, and I looked and I was like, wait, what is that? And I did a double take, and it was a flyer for for a Sons of Confederate Veterans Memorial Day celebration event. And so, as like Clint, the Black man, like as a person, is like, there's no way I'm going to spend the day with the Sons of Confederate Veterans. Clint, the writer, is like, this is where the story is telling you that you have to go. And so I ended up coming back for the Sons of Confederate Veterans Memorial Day celebration. And it was at once an unsettling and incredibly clarifying experience. Because part of what you realize is that for so many people, history is not about primary source documents or empirical evidence. It is a story that they are told. And it is a story that they tell. It is an heirloom that is passed down across generations. It's a story in which loyalty and precedent, loyalty and community and family and lineage all take precedence over truth. And I always remember a guy named Jeff who was a member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, and we were having a conversation. And part of what he said was, he talked about how his grandfather used to bring him to this cemetery, and they would sit at this gazebo in the middle of the cemetery, and his grandfather would sing him the Dixie anthem and tell him these stories of the brave men who were buried here and how the Civil War actually had nothing to do with slavery, and that's all just a sort of lie meant to denigrate the Southern soldier and their bravery protecting Southern culture, et cetera, et cetera. And these are the same stories that Jeff says he now loves to tell his grandchildren, his granddaughters. He likes to come with them at dusk and watch the deer sort of scamper through the tombstones and sing them the Dixie song that his grandfather sang him. And so for Jeff, if he is to accept the contention that it's not even a contention, the fact that the Civil War was very clearly fought and began because of slavery, that would threaten to sort of disintegrate and decimate so much of who he understands his grandfather, the nature of how he understands his relationship to his grandfather, and subsequently how he understands himself. And it doesn't matter that you can look at any number of primary source documents, including the Declarations of Confederate Secession that were signed in 1860 and 1861 as these states seceded, where a state like Mississippi says very directly, our position is thoroughly aligned with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world, quote, unquote. Like, they are not vague about why they're seceding. They're not opaque about this. They're very clear. Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy in 1861, in his infamous Cornerstone speech, says the cause of the great revolution that we find ourselves in, the cause of this great rupture of the Union, is slavery, and that the Confederacy is founded on the principle that the white man is superior to the Black person, and that slavery is the cornerstone upon which our new nation will be built. So, but for Jeff, it doesn't matter, because he cannot accept that information without it becoming without it becoming an existential crisis, right? It is not simply a matter of inconvenience or a matter of historical reassessment. It is a question of identity. It is a question of how does that shape or reshape or threaten the story that you have told yourself, about your family, about your community, and how you all fit into the larger American landscape and story. And are you willing to accept information that that threatens that, and accept information that makes you have to reassess the very community that has given you a sense of self? And to be clear, there are many millions of people who do that every day. My friend that I went with, a guy named William, is a white guy who came with me in part because he's on his own journey of thinking of his lineage, and in part because my wife wasn't going to let me go without a white person. She was like, "You're not going to spend the day with the Sons of Confederate Veterans by yourself. That's not going to happen." And so we went, and he is reckoning with the fact that his ancestors owned enslaved people, and his ancestors fought for the Confederacy. But he is like many people. He says, these are my ancestors, and they fought a war for a terrible, terrible, indefensible cause. And I am not defined by the decisions that my ancestors made. My values, my ideology, my politics are different, and I can make a different set of choices about how I want to be in the world and what I want, what sort of world I want to build for my own children. But there are other people like Jeff who are unwilling to make that choice. And so I think that it was revealing about how the sort of contemporary manifestation of the lost cause reveals itself.
All right, I want to ask you now about your visit to the Louisiana State Penitentiary, known by many as Angola Prison, an interesting name we might talk about, or informal name. So your tour started just outside of the prison, actually, right, in the museum, in the prison museum, in which there's a gift shop.
Right.
And behind the checkout counter, there's a large photograph on the wall. Could you describe the photograph and the message it was conveying?
Yeah, so in the photograph is it's how big was it? 20, 30-foot long photograph. And it's this sort of big group of bodies. And you see the back of these people, and it's all Black men dressed in, it's a black and white photo. And the sun is rising in the distance, just above the trees. And next to them is a woman, a white woman on horseback with a gun over her shoulder. And so for context, Angola is the largest maximum security prison in the country. It is 18,000 acres wide, bigger than the island of Manhattan. It is a place where 75% of the people held there are Black men. Over 70% of them are serving life sentences. And it is built on top of a former plantation. And what I tell folks is that if you were to go to Germany, and you had the largest maximum security prison in Germany, and it was built on top of a former concentration camp, in which the people held there were disproportionately Jewish, that place would rightfully be a global emblem of anti-Semitism. It would be abhorrent. It would be disgusting. We would never allow a place like that to exist because it would so clearly be anti-Semitic and so clearly run counter to our moral and ethical sensibilities. And yet here in the United States, we have the largest maximum security prison in the country, where the vast majority of people are Black men serving life sentences, many of whom were sentenced as children, many of whom were sentenced by non-unanimous juries, which has since been rendered unconstitutional by the Supreme Court of the United States, working in fields of what was once a plantation, while someone watches them on horseback with a gun across their lap, picking crops for pennies on the hour. And not only is that place sort of indifferent to or unwilling to interrogate its history and relationship on this front, but as you mentioned, it has a gift shop. And in this gift shop, you encounter this photograph, right? And surrounding the gift shop, not only do you see this photograph of what is such a profoundly unsettlingly parallel image to chattel slavery, you also see it's a gift shop that sells hoodies and t-shirts and coffee mugs and shot glasses and stuffed animals dressed in prison garb. And on lots of the paraphernalia and on some of these coffee mugs, for example, it has the silhouette of a watchtower. And above and below the watchtower, it says Angola, a gated community, as if to make a mockery of or belittle the experiences of thousands of people who remain incarcerated there. And so for me, when I go to a place like Angola, it's like, what are the ways that a history of white supremacy not only enacts physical violence against people's bodies, but also collectively numbs us to certain types of violences that in a different global context would so clearly be unacceptable? Like, what is it that allows that prison to exist on that land in that way, in this moment? And what are the sort of failures of public consciousness and public memory in the United States that would allow something like that to even begin to happen? And what are the failures and how does it reflect, as the scholar Celia Hartman says, how the afterlife of slavery continues to shape our social, political, and economic institutions, how it very clearly shapes our carceral institutions. And so to bring it back to your original point, like when I see a photo like that, in this context, on that land, I'm there on that tour with a guy named Norris Henderson, who spent almost 30 years incarcerated in Angola. And as we're on the bus leaving, in the distance, we see these men working in the fields, like lifting their shovels and digging them into the earth, lifting their garden hose and digging them into the earth, lifting their spades and digging them into the earth. And Norris looks at the men and he looks at his hands. And he has these cuts and these calluses on his hands from working in the fields all those years. And he's like, Clint, I can't explain to you what it feels like to pick cotton for 7 cents an hour on the same land where your ancestors might have picked cotton 150, 200 years ago. Right? So to the people who are incarcerated and formerly incarcerated in Angola, the relationship between chattel slavery and our current carceral state is very clear. Right? And that's not to say that prison and slavery are the same thing. They are phenomenologically different entities and should be treated as such. But it also demands that we take seriously the way that the residue and the remnants of that institution very much continue to shape the landscape of mass incarceration today. And so, I could have written a whole chapter just on Angola. It was so haunting. And I'm someone who's worked in prisons for the past 6 or 7 years. And so I think I was surprised by my capacity to be surprised when I went there.
Yeah, I want to ask you something else about that. Again, in this chapter throughout, but I was really struck that in this chapter, while you, as you do throughout your book, again, provide extensive archival and other historical research, you also are writing about your very specific subjective responses to these sites and what your senses took in, how you felt being in these spaces. I think that's part of the power of the book, that the reader is so intimately aligned with your perspective as you move in these spaces and move out of them. And at one point, you describe a part of the tour that took you to the Red Hat cell block. And you wrote, and I'm going to quote something you mentioned just a minute ago, I had taught writing and literature in prisons for years, but had never seen a place as difficult to write about as the Red Hat cell block. So could you first describe what the Red Hat cell block is and why was it uniquely difficult to write about, or what was that difficulty, sort of what limit of almost speakability did you encounter there for yourself?
Yeah, it's so the Red Hat cell block is a place at Angola that used to be Angola's sort of death row, and it is a sort of stretch of cells that have no climate control. So whatever you're inside and you're completely susceptible to the elements. So in the summer, it's 120, 130, 140 degrees. In the winter, you're freezing. And it is written about, so I have really powerfully and unsettlingly in Albert Woodfox's book, Solitary. And he spent 41 years incarcerated at Angola and spent some time in the Red Hat cell block. And part of what he writes about is how some of the men were served their food was served in wheelbarrows, how they were not given a proper place to use the bathroom. And so people they defecated in sort of buckets in the corner that were only collected and taken out once a week if they were lucky. And it is this place that sort of embodies all of the most unsettling aspects of our prison system and the history of our prison system. And I think for me, to be there, to sort of stretch my hands across the cell and to be able to touch each side of the room, I don't have a particularly long wingspan, but to be able to touch each side almost both ways and think of how claustrophobic it was, think of how cold it would have been in the winter, how hot it would have been in the summer, the smell of your own feces sort of just festering in the corner of your cell for days and days and days, the way you were beaten by guards, the way that you were inside, the way that every sort of sociological analysis and psychological analysis proven now solitary confinement is torture. You know, on top of the fact that in it was a replica of what they called gruesome gurney, which was the electric chair that they used to put people to death for until they switched to lethal injection, I think in the 90s. And I sat in the chair and I thought about a kid named Willie Francis, who was one of the youngest people sentenced to death, and he is the only person who he was 17 when he was killed, and he is the only person who was sentenced to death, put in the electric chair. The electric chair failed to kill him, and then they brought him back a year later and used it again to this time successfully take his life. So I think the aggregate of all of those things just made it feel so indefensibly gruesome and cruel. I mean, just a cruel place. And like, what do you have to think of a person? What do you have to think of a group of people in order to treat them that way and to keep them there? And how many different institutional and bureaucratic levels are there, right? Because it's not just an interpersonal thing. It's not just the guards treated them poorly. It is that on the level of policy and legislation, that a place like that was allowed to exist for so long. You know, it was beyond anything that I think my own words can capture or could capture. And I think part of your point about the sort of revealing of my own feelings and sensibilities, part of what I wanted to do with this book was to write a book of history that in some ways felt like a novel. And in some senses, that means that I am the sort of protagonist of that story, because you are on a journey with me going to these different places. And so I'm the sort of first person protagonist. And I think what some of the best novelists do, and I studied a lot of novelists in the process of writing this book, is at strategic moments, especially in a first person narrative, reveal to the reader the interiority of the protagonist's feelings and thoughts, right? And not at every moment, but often enough so that it almost is a way to give the reader permission to sort of process and feel what they are seeing and experiencing alongside you. Because, you know, if I'm seeing all of this horrific stuff, whether at Angola or the Monticello or Whitney or Blandford, or joyous things that I see in Galveston and some other player, or, you know, other places like that, it gives the reader permission to take a breath and say, ooh, I'm feeling that way too. Or to say, I'm feeling really like this is a beautiful moment also, right? Like me sort of pausing for a moment from the scene itself and saying how I'm experiencing the scene. I think both is a literary device that I think many novelists have used effectively for a long time. And also, I think in a nonfiction context, is a moment of not quite respite for the reader, but a moment to simultaneously sort of alongside you process so much of what you've seen and heard and learned.
All right. Well, as you know, our conversation today is part of the IHC's public event series, Regeneration. And one of the themes we're exploring this year is the issue of intergenerational futures. How the worlds we make and set out to remake will really only be as strong as our ability to learn from our ties to earlier generations. So at the end of your book, you turn your focus to the generations of your own family. And you write about a trip you took to the National Museum of African American History and Culture with your grandfather, that is your mother's father, and also with your grandmother, your father's mother. And you also described the conversations you had with both of them about the impact of slavery upon their lives. Why did you decide to conclude your book by writing about this trip and these conversations?
I mean, I spent 4 years writing this book. Um, and I think at some point I had this moment where I realized that I was like traveling all across the country, across the ocean, asking strangers these personal, intimate questions about their lives and their life stories. And it never brought that same level of intentionality to my own family. And I didn't really know, I didn't have a good reason as to why that was. And I think sometimes you're like with your family a lot, and some, but you're not always being intentional in the way that you engage with them, because you might be sitting watching a game, or people might be, playing a board game, or all the sorts of things people do at Thanksgiving. When I'm with my grandparents these days, I'm like sitting at the dinner table at Thanksgiving trying not to have my 2-year-old like throw macaroni across the room. And so that doesn't sort of lend itself to a deep excavation of your childhood growing up in 1930s Mississippi. And so I was like, let me do the same thing with my grandparents that I've done with, the dozens of other people that I've spoken to for this book. And it was such an important moment, and it was the catalyst of it was that we were walking through the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and I was pushing my grandfather, who was born in 1930 Jim Crow Mississippi, in his wheelchair, and my grandmother was walking a little bit ahead of us, who was born in 1939 Jim Crow Florida. And my grandfather and I, we went through the exhibit on Emmett Till, which has the casket Emmett Till was buried in. And we were looking at the casket and sort of just sitting there, the two of us. And he was saying how Emmett Till was killed in the county just over from where he and my grandmother lived. And as we were walking through some of the other exhibits, my grandmother had this refrain when I asked her later. She was just like, I lived it. I lived it. I lived it. And I sort of looked around this museum and realized that so much of the history and so much of the violence that was documented in this museum were things that my grandparents experienced firsthand, things that they lived through, and part of what it did also was give me a sense of my proximity to this history, right? Because the book is about trying to give us a sense of our collective physical proximity to this history, and how the scars of slavery are etched into the landscape of this country everywhere. But part of what I think part of the journey of understanding our physical proximity serves as a catalyst and an entry point to our temporal proximity, which is to say, like at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the woman who opened that museum alongside the Obama family in 2016, Ruth Bonner was her name. She was the daughter of an enslaved person, not the granddaughter, not the great granddaughter. This woman who rang the bell to signal the opening of this museum in 2016. Her father had been born into chattel slavery. My grandfather's grandfather was enslaved. So when my 4-year-old son sits on my grandfather's lap, I imagine my grandfather sitting on his grandfather's lap. And I'm reminded that this history we tell ourselves was a long time ago wasn't that long ago at all. And so the idea that someone would suggest that this history has nothing to do with the contemporary landscape of inequality, that it does not continue to inform our social, political, and economic landscape, is revealed to be so deeply morally and intellectually disingenuous. And I think from the interview and conversations with my grandparents really drove that home, because they are only a generation or two removed from one of the most heinous things that this country has ever done. And there's people alive today who loved, who were raised by, who were in community with people born into slavery. I did an NPR interview a couple months ago, and one of the women who called in was telling a story about her pappy, which was her great grandfather. And she was talking about how she was raised by this man. This is a woman, I think she was in her 70s. And she was talking about how she was raised by this man, raised by her great grandfather, and how he still had the scars from having been born into slavery on his body, right? This is a woman who's 70 years old, calling NPR, going to Zumba classes, going to the grocery store, going to her grandkids' soccer games. They are still with us. This history is still with us. It is still so present. And there are 40 million Black people in this country. And so in some ways, each of those Black people is a memorial to that history, right? Like there are the physical memorials and physical spaces, but every Black person in this country, all 13% of us, are part of the history and lineage of what happened. And I think that is what makes it so hard for this conversation around reparations to gain political traction, is because you can't once you recognize that what this country did was as horrific as what it was, it is not enough to simply say we made a mistake. You have to begin to make amends for that mistake. And there are millions of us. There are tens of millions of Black people in this country still, and that's people are unwilling to sort of take that next step in terms of what repair for generations of harm might look like.
Right. Well, so, and this is my last question or request actually to you. So in the book, you describe how you were writing your first book of poetry in the aftermath of the Ferguson uprising. And you say that of all your work, or that all of your work, even the work that is a response to violence, all of your work stems from a place of love, and sort of as going back to your first comment about Jefferson. And you say love of your community, your family, and of those hoping to build a better world than the one we live in. So I want to ask you if we could end our conversation, and before we go to questions from our audience, if we could end our conversation by having you read us your poem called A Lineage, which is from your first book, Counting Descent.
I would be happy to. This book came out 5 years ago. I think I read this poem, last time I read this poem out loud might have been like 4 years ago. So it's been a long time. This is from Counting Descent. I'm like, who's that young guy on there? Well, his beard didn't even connect yet. Look at that. A lineage. I was named after my father, who was named after his father, who fought a war for his country against a place he couldn't pronounce. He held a gun he says he never used. The gun left his hand, but I don't think it ever left him. He came back and cleaned carpets for white folks, then moved his family into the same neighborhood as them. Pop still remembers looking around and seeing no one who looked like him. Most days, I look around and don't see anyone who looks like me. Most days, I'm still told I am picking up after white folks. I am trying to disentangle my name from my grandfather's gun. I'm trying to pick it up off the carpet and place it back where it belongs.
Thank you. All right. Are you ready for some questions?
I am ready.
All right, here we go. The first question is about the locations that you included in the book. And the question is, how did you choose those locations? And are you planning another book with the places you researched and didn't include?
Oh man. How the Word Is Past Part 2. I don't know. I mean, how did I choose the place in the book? It's kind of like I was alluding to before. I don't know if I finished the story. I might have lost my train of thought, but some of the places I went and wrote about, I knew I wanted to write about. Like I went to Monticello and I knew I wanted to write about Monticello. I went to Angola, I knew I wanted to write about Angola. For some of these places, I didn't know until I got there. Like I had no idea that I was going to write about a Confederate cemetery. And I had no idea that such a huge part of that chapter would be spending the day with the Sons of Confederate Veterans. Because there's no way for me to plan that, right? Like it was the nature of circumstance that sort of led to that happening. You might be able to hear my daughter unwillingly being put to bed at the moment in the background. But um, yeah, so part of it is the happenstance and serendipity of where the story took me, and that was exciting, and I liked that. I also, I do a chapter on New York City, because I really wanted, for anybody who's reading my book, might be one of the first books about slavery that they read. I wanted to disabuse them of the idea that it was not something that happened in the North. And I wrote about New York, but I could have written about Boston, could have written about New Haven, could have written about Providence, could have written about a whole host of places throughout New England and the Midwest. I could have written about Detroit, that all have very real and concrete relationships to that history. I mean, New York was the second largest slave market in the country for an extended period of time after Charleston, South Carolina. It's a place where the mayor of New York City in 1861 tried to convince the rest of the city to secede from the Union alongside the Confederacy, because the social and economic interest of New York City were so deeply invested in the slaveocracy of the South, all the way from the insurance companies to the banks to manufacturing. And so that history is very present and very real. And for a long time in colonial New York, I think 1 in 5 people there were enslaved. So that was I wanted to go there. I don't have like regrets about where I went and didn't go. But had COVID not happened, I would have written a chapter about slavery in California. I just really thought it would have the book, I'm very happy with what it is, and it is, the universe decided that that's what it should be. But that is, the relationship between slavery and like the 49ers, and the sort of gold rush is one that not a lot of people know about, but one that is very real and relevant. So I don't know if that demands another book. I might write an article for the Atlantic about it. I am interested in and sort of thinking about international iterations of it, in the sense that I'm curious and fascinated by how different countries reckon with and memorialize and build monuments to the crimes that they have committed. So I just came back from spending a week in Berlin, and visited 8 or 9 sites dedicated to memorializing the Holocaust. Spoke to more than a dozen people who are museum curators and historians and academics, and learned a lot about one of the worst things that has ever happened in world history, and trying to make sense of how does Germany's why does memorialization look so different in Germany than it does in the United States? And I think there are a lot of answers to that hopefully I will be writing about soon. So I
could even start in this country. The way the Holocaust is memorialized is so different across the country too. But yeah, that's
absolutely and so we'll see. Stay tuned.
Well, here's your third book. Okay, for your third book, and an audience member asked whether you plan to go further and visit cities in Europe where ships left to do trade in the New World as well. And the audience member is thinking of Nantes, France, where most of the ships left to do trade, and where there is a ton of memorials to Africans and the slave trade and the architecture of the city. So that's book 3.
Okay, I would ask if this audience member wants to send me an email with more information on that. Please feel free. Clint Smith, I'm going to put it in the chat.
Okay.
This is the journalist in me who's like, wait a second. There's no chat. Oh, there is a chat.
No chat. But if you forward it, we can certainly forward it to you. If you write to me, I will forward it to Clint and put you in touch.
I think I found panelists and attendees. If you want to send that to me, audience member, that is really interesting. Yeah, I mean, because I just got back from Berlin and I'm thinking a lot about that question, not and even beyond slavery, but just like how do places talk about their work? And so I'm not familiar with Nantes,
Not, yeah.
that Nantes, but would love to hear more about that. Um, yeah, so let me know.
So one of our audience members would like you to say more about reparations, which you mentioned. What do you think are important next steps?
Yeah, I mean, I think reparations are really important. I am no economist, and so I can't speak to what specifically it should look like. I think there are a lot of different forms it can take. I think in part it happens on a localized level, right? Because we're not only talking about reparations for slavery, we're also talking about reparations for 80 years of Jim Crow. We're also talking about reparations for decades of housing segregation and things that you can map. I mean, you can literally look and see. You can look up who applied for loans and didn't get them. You can look up different areas that were redlined on these maps from the federal government and the loan corporations. And some cities are making it, taking their own initiative to do that. I know Evanston, Illinois, outside of Chicago, recently started providing reparations to people who to Black families between 19, I don't know the specific dates, maybe like 1940 and 1960 or 1930 and 1960, who were impacted by redlining. And there's a lot of debate about whether it's enough, whether it is adequate, whether it is commensurate, what they're doing is commensurate with the harm. And I'm not a part of that community, so I can't speak to that. But I do think that it is important for local communities to figure out what mitigating that harm, mitigating that historical harm might look like for them. And I think HR 40 is really important, which is creating a committee and to study the idea of reparations and what it might look like. But I think a huge part of it, and a guy that I interview in my chapter about Dakar, Senegal, Hassan, who's a teacher on Gorée Island, he talks about how reparations can't only be the sort of extension of material, like a check, right? He's like, you can't just write somebody a check and give somebody money and then it's done. But like, it has to be, you have to repair not only the material harm, but also repair the sort of public consciousness, right? Because part of the problem is that we don't have in this country a collective understanding of the history of this country. We see it manifest itself most recently in our politics in a very direct way, right? Like critical race theory is now the boogeyman of the right, and will be undoubtedly, after last night in the elections across the country, undoubtedly be used over the course of the next few years to animate and bring up and sort of stoke fear and fervor in people for whom, as I mentioned before, a reassessment of this country's history represents not only an inconvenience, but an existential threat, right? It is, if you tell a different story about America that is not aligned with the story of America that millions of people have been told, then the story millions of people tell about themselves begins to sort of crumble and disintegrate, and that is scary for a lot of people. So yeah, I don't even remember what this original question was. I've kind of meandered. What was it?
What was this? I can't remember either. I'm sorry to say, moved on to another question.
Okay.
We'll extend the thoughts that you're sharing right now. Okay. Well, let me ask you this question. So given what you've said about the way knowledge suspends certain narratives that people cling to, and how that has to be addressed, this audience member asks whether you feel that public history in all of its forms does it have the potential to be a loving act?
Does public history have the potential to be a loving act? Absolutely. I mean, sort of, if you can't tell from the book, like obsessed with public history. And it's kind of become the thing that I follow and I'm interested in. I just wrote this piece for The Atlantic, should come out in a week or so, about the history of what public memory around lynching looks like here in my home state of Maryland, and how Maryland is the only state in the country that has created a commission through its legislators, through the state legislature, to study the history of lynching in this state, and to create markers and have these soil collection ceremonies throughout the state, where you collect the soil from the sites of lynching and sort of do it as a commemorative process. And I attended one, and it was very moving. So I mean, even that act, right? I mean, the act of me physically getting down on the ground with a shovel and digging into the soil that is on the site of where someone was lynched in this county 100 years ago, and pouring that soil into the jar, the sort of tactile nature of it. For me, that is very much an act of love, right? Because the act of remembering is an act of love. Because when you choose to remember, you choose to see someone, or you choose to see, you're not only seeing history, but you're seeing people, right? Because people no longer are historical abstractions, but they are like individuals whose in this context, whose lives were taken by mob violence, right? So like when I think of, it is no longer like lynching thousands of people across the South. This is where John Diggs Dorsey was killed in 1903, or this is where Howard Cooper was pulled from this jail when he was hiding under his mattress and was lynched at 15 years old. And then where parts of his body and parts of the rope were given away as souvenirs. Like it becomes intimate, and you can't turn away from it. And I think that intimacy is, and that centering of personhood and humanity is reflective of a real love that I think is embodied by so many of the public historians that I met, so many of these docents and public historians who at once extend an incredible level of grace and generosity, but also demand accountability and responsibility, right? When you show up, and they're not going to be like, can't believe you don't know this. Why don't you know this about Jefferson? But they are going to be like, now that you're here, the expectation is that you hold this information and don't run from it, and don't fight it, and don't push back against it, no matter what you feel like it's telling you about you and yourself. As Teresa says in that book, in that chapter, she's like, when people hear, a different story of Thomas Jefferson, they hear a different story about themselves. And that's, as we've been saying throughout this hour, that is difficult for folks.
Thank you so much, Clint, for taking part in our Regeneration series. And thank you all for attending. As you exit, please fill out the short post-event survey, and you can sign up for our mailing list. And again, be well, and good night to everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.